Hi everyone, welcome to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism's latest TBIJ live event. We're here to look at hidden influence and answer the question, how are you being manipulated online? I'm the Bureau's big tech editor, Jasper Jackson, and we're here to discuss influence operations. And one of the reasons for that is that the Bureau has just launched a new project looking at influence operations and misinformation ahead of the UK election. We've got a really stellar panel of guests for you here today. Coming up first, we have Nina Jankowicz. Nina Jankowicz is an internationally recognized expert on disinformation and democratization. She's held some really impressive jobs. She's currently the Vice President at the UK-based Centre for Information Resilience, which is a non-profit focused on countering disinformation. As well as Nina, we have Cheyenne Shiradze. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Cheyenne is a journalist at BBC Verify, which is the unit set up to answer questions about misinformation and also do various other things around explaining how journalistic processes work. He's also one of the most impressive people I've seen on the internet debunking examples of misinformation, disinformation, and hopefully he'll be running through a little bit of that with us later. And then rounding out our panel, we have Carl Miller. Carl is the founder of the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media at Demos and its partner organization, Chasm Technology. And he spent the last decade researching social media intelligence and misinformation and how this whole ecosystem sort of all works and the vulnerabilities. So we're here to discuss influence operations, but obviously that's a term that not everyone has heard of. So the first thing I'd like to do is sort of ask our panel to define for them what they think influence operations are. First off, I'll go to Carl. Carl, talk us through influence ops.
All right, thank you, Jasper. Hello, everyone watching this. Yes, so I mean, I suppose as an idea, it's kind of intended really to replace disinformation, or at least kind of augment it as a way of trying to understand what we think the problem is online. Influence operations, to me, are concerted, organized, kind of professional, usually kind of covert attempts to try and do the same things that actually lots of other kinds of activities do, whether they work through kinetic spaces or financial spaces or others, which is ultimately to achieve kind of behavioral and attitudinal ends. They can be done these things for all kinds of reasons, everything from geopolitical advantage all the way through to profit. But the idea is that you kind of maneuver in information spaces. I know this sounds weird maybe to people, but you kind of maneuver in information spaces in information spaces as you would in air, sea, land, or space above you. Like it's a theatre of war. It's an area of conflict, and lots of actors, be they states, intelligence agencies, electoral campaigns, or others, kind of see information spaces now as areas that they need to maneuver within, to dominate, and to win within. And influence operations is how they do that.
And we've seen recently Vladimir Putin has talked very openly about how the information space is one of the most important theatres of his war. So this is something that people are very actively pursuing with very serious goals. Nina, have you got anything to add to that? Or what's your concept of influence ops and what they do?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Carl said. I think there's a couple things that I'd note. The first is that, when we talk about influence operations and in particular disinformation or misinformation, people often think, okay, when people are talking about those words, disinfo, misinfo, it means that things are cut and dry fake news, that dirty term that none of us in the industry like to use anymore, right? That they're just false. And that's not true. And I'm hoping Cheyenne will talk about this a little bit more. But it can be just misleading information. It can be true information that's packaged differently, again, in order to change attitudes, as Carl said. The other thing that I'd add is that my work in Central and Eastern Europe has really laid bare how often the online influence operations that are coupled kind of with this informational component have offline influence components. That might be through civil society organizations. It might be through the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, particularly in countries like the Republic of Georgia. It might be, offline protests and things like that, which we saw here in the United States around the 2016 U.S. presidential election. We often forget, we thought that these were just $100,000 worth of ads bought in rubles, right? But actually, there was offline organization of individuals and protests going on as well, and that's all part of the fabric of influence operations, as is the movement of dirty money to fund influence operations, as well as in some cases organized crime. And I would point your viewers to the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, OCCRP, which does a lot of digging into how all this stuff is financed.
We're big fans of them. They do great work. Cheyenne, you're very much at the coalface of a lot of this. You see a lot of it. You expose a lot of it on a regular basis. And I know a lot of what you do deal with would be classed as misinformation as we thought about it. But you see so much of it. I mean, what's your concept of this kind of this space and how people try and manipulate it?
Yeah, to me, influence operations are definitely the most sophisticated, complex aspect of the sort of disinformation world that now, as a problem, everyone in the last few years has started to figure out that in the digital age, that's a new thing that we have to consider, and it's quite serious. First of all, spotting it is extremely difficult, and when I say it's extremely difficult, I don't mean for the average person. I mean for journalists, for reporters, for experts, even for major platforms who have tons and tons of systems in place, and some of the best experts in the field to spot these types of operations are extremely difficult. For people to first of all spot them and then prove that something is actually a nefarious campaign originating from someplace. Now, as Carl said, people usually, there's a definition of influence operations that politicians usually use. It's like, this nefarious state is trying to intervene in our politics or in our campaigns. And that's, I think, the image most people have got. But when we're talking about influence operations, it could be anything. It could be politics. It could be scammers. It could be people who are after your money. And it could be also, in some cases, people who are just doing it for the lols, believe it or not. But the type that most people are interested in, and obviously most reporters and politicians are after, which is, we're talking about a campaign by somebody or a group of people. It could be a company, it could be a state, it could be sometimes one really, really good individual who's creating usually a set or a network of accounts on a major platform or on several platforms. So it could be cross-platform, or it could be focused on one platform. These accounts might appear genuine to you, but they're not genuine. They're not real people behind those accounts. They are being directed by somebody or a group of people for a particular purpose. They want to direct your attention towards some specific issue. Now, when it involves politics, it could be somebody who wants you to think a specific way about the war in Ukraine. It could be somebody who wants you to vote in a certain way in an election. It could be somebody who wants to shape and change views in a particular country about a third country, or about geopolitics in a particular place. So not only the thing that I find usually is difficult for people who are just, particularly when we want to explain this to politicians, is the way platforms look at influence operations. They don't look at content. Most of what journalists do is try to focus on the content. The content to platforms doesn't matter. What matters are, do we have evidence of a network, a set of, say, tens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of accounts that are operating in the same way, posting similar content, but all of these accounts could be related to each other and can be proven with evidence that are originating from somewhere that they claim not to be from. So that the accounts says they're from Pakistan, they're actually from Afghanistan, or from Russia, or from China, or from the United Kingdom, wherever it could be. And then we could link these accounts together because they're operating in the same manner. Either they're posting similar content, or they're amplifying each other in a certain way, or they're pushing users into thinking in a certain way. That's how platforms see it. Obviously, politicians and reporters sometimes see it in a different way. But to platforms, it's the way those accounts behave that matters. Now, when it comes to content, it gets more important, because sometimes we as reporters are more interested in, okay, these are obviously a network of fake accounts that are being directed from Russia or from China. Or, by the way, just to add, don't assume that it's just Russia or China or these kinds of states. Recently, Meta actually took down an influence operation by the French military, trying to influence an African country. The U.S. government has done influence operations on Meta, on Instagram, on Facebook, on Instagram, and they've been taken down. So pretty much everyone at this stage is at it, by the way. That I'm sure there are hundreds out there that are still undetected and people don't know. But actually, at the moment, we're investigating one, and we're absolutely baffled by the size of it and the fact that up to this point, it had not been detected. So yeah, everyone is at it. It's extremely difficult to figure out. There's actually a network that is doing something on a particular platform or a series of platform, and the most difficult aspect of it for me personally, and I think Nina and Carl will also agree, is proving that this operation is originating from this place or from this PR group or from this person or from this state. That is the $100 million question most of the time. And unfortunately, when we spot something, platforms are not helpful in terms of, because sometimes it's impossible for them even to prove where it's originating from. But sometimes they can, and they don't tell us.
I know from you talk to people who deal with this stuff on a regular basis, and they often say, attribution is the hardest part of this kind of work. And it's going to be a gargantuan task for our project, and something we're really trying to take on and bring together the different aspects of what the platforms do, what the journalists do, and trying to make sure that everyone, working with other organizations, because we'll be working with Chasm that Carl runs to do all this. You talked a bit about some of the people who might be behind this. It might be the Russian government, might be the American government, or it might be, scammers, etc. In terms of the people actually sort of doing this, not necessarily the guys who commission it, but the people doing this on a day-to-day basis, what are the kind of people? I mean, again, the classic example that we all think of is a person in a St. Petersburg basement tapping away on behalf of the government. They probably are some of the people that are definitely doing this stuff, and we've got a lot of evidence that happened. But what are the kind of people doing this actual activity day to day? Because I think that's changed a bit in the recent past, hasn't it? Nina, have you got some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, it really varies from operation to operation. And one thing that I stumbled upon, thanks to a friend of mine who is an international journalist and ahead of the 2020 election, she started getting spammed on her public Instagram, which was mostly just pictures of her dog and, personal stuff, with all these comments that said, Crimea is part of Russia, Crimea is part of Russia. And she said, Nina, can you take a look at this? And of course, if you ask that to a disinformation researcher, immediately days and days are just gone down the toilet. So I did some digging, and I was able to uncover that not only did my journalist friend, who's really, she's notable, but not like well known, she got spammed, but all of these celebrities got spammed. It was like Ina Garten, the celebrity chef, and some basketball players, and Beyonce, and all of these huge names were getting these Crimea-focused content. And I was able to find thousands of Instagram content comments right before the election that were connected to the election. Like they said, why are none of the presidential candidates talking about Crimea? And I was like, I don't know, maybe because this is the US presidential election. But anyway, and I was able to trace them back to a comment farm website. So essentially people would get paid something like 5 ruble cents per comment that they made. And I have no proof that this was necessarily Russia, but it was a site that was in Russian language. And the commenters appeared to be real people who had real content on their profiles for the most part, scattered all over the world. Some were in the Middle East, some were in Central Asia, some were in Russia. Some of them had fake profiles that clearly, they populated with a bunch of random pictures. One of them was a little fox in a forest that was leaving these comments. And some of them were real, right? And so I think these were people just trying to make money. And this is something that I think we need to understand. It's not all, nefarious individuals working for the intelligence services of adversarial states. Sometimes unwitting or really willing individuals are roped into these schemes because they want cash. And there were examples of that in the 2016 and 2020 elections as well. But on the other hand, we can also, of course, see PR firms who are brought into this stuff. There have been a number of examples of foreign PR firms being contracted by both foreign malign actors and then other nation states that are trying to play the influence game. Very famously, of course, Clarissa Ward went and knocked on the door of a Ghanaian troll farm a couple of years ago that was working for the Internet Research Agency in Russia. So the web is becoming much, much more obfuscated than it used to be, and the connections between people and institutions are not as clear or multifaceted. Now they're more multifaceted than they used to be. So I think things are not what they seem necessarily online, and that's something important to keep in mind. The final point that I'll add, though, is that we see political parties engaging in this stuff as well. There have been a lot of cases, in particular in Central and Eastern Europe, where both opposition and current political parties that are in power have been engaging in this sort of operation and trying to kind of expose one another, which I think is quite interesting. They think, what's good for you is not necessarily good for vice versa. And we've seen similar stuff happening in the United States, of course, in the 2020 election, the TikTok teens at the Tulsa, Oklahoma Trump rally, buying up all of the tickets for the Trump rally so that individuals who supported the former president weren't able to show up. That's a type of online influence operation. Whether it's malign or not is in the eye of the beholder, I suppose.
I should just add that you can, of course, ask questions of our guests, whichever platform you're watching on. What Nina was talking about there, and this more complex area is really interesting to me. And I think particularly there seems to be an increasing professionalization in some areas of this, where you have, organizations, PR firms, but also very much specialists as well, or special divisions, potentially PR firms, developing skill sets and offering their work for hire. Carl, I mean, that's the development I think is really interesting here. That's sort of happened relatively recently, it seems.
For sure. So on the one hand, you have professionalization within all the different structures which allow that kind of thing to happen, and specialization, of course. So people specializing in black hat search engine optimization, and other people specializing in content creation, and other people specializing in memetics and so on. That's obvious. Wherever you get a large bureaucracy like a military involved, you're always going to have that kind of specialization occurring. But then at the same time, you've also got amateurization. And the kind of person I wanted to introduce you to was a Venezuelan kind of digital soldier, as he saw himself. This is actually a BBC investigation that I was part of, and we discovered through talking to him that the Venezuelan government essentially has incentivized online manipulation by rewarding people via the social security system of Venezuela. So via the very same app that you get money to buy food and fuel and other things, necessities, you are rewarded to constantly and without stopping, kind of tweeting a series of completely nonsensical kind of party hashtags and keeping them at the top of the Venezuelan trending box. So this is something which, on the one hand, is kind of becoming so sophisticated. I think it's well departed the ability of just normal people to spot it. And I think the kind of these bots that one finds on Twitter still, I would kind of really view those as being like World War I tanks, kind of littered still they're not where the state of the art is. But on the other, states and others finding ways of bringing many thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people in some way who are kind of also victims, really. They're not necessarily the kind of like the baddies in this story, but bringing them into that world as well. It's diversifying, it's stretching. It's also spinning off into the private sector, lastly. So people that have learned this craft, likely with states, in the same way that the kind of private intelligence world has grown. I think we've now seen them spinning off their own, for-profit kind of concerns in order to maybe make more money than they were in their kind of plodding bureaucracy.
And of course, one of the key areas is in the environment where there have been a fair few examples and increasingly suggestions and evidence that there are concerted, professionalized campaigns to affect the environmental discussions, often for potentially commercial gain. On sort of what the goals are, Cheyenne, you again come across a lot of this stuff. It can be really hard to work out what people are trying to achieve, can't it? But what are the sort of goals people seem to be going for when they do these campaigns, where they attempt to influence the discussion and the debate?
Well, normally, it's political or financial gain. Like that's the broad category that normally it falls into. But when it's financial gain, it's usually scammers. I mean, you'd be surprised how many influence operations are being run on major platforms by scammers, trying to get your money in different ways. Sometimes it's like selling stolen artwork. Sometimes it's selling stolen products. Sometimes it's sort of luring you in with some specific content, and then you get in, and then they ask for donations, and the donations are basically based on stuff that is completely inauthentic. It could, that's usually for financial gain, but for political gain, it's obviously you're getting involved in the field of obviously geopolitics and what state is looking for what in a particular place, or as Nina said, sometimes there's like an election coming up, and 2 or 3, 4 major political parties in a country are sort of neck and neck, or one party wants to get over the other one. And by the way, elections are now not fought in the old way. What you do online campaigning is a massive part of any election. So they do it online. I mean, it's happened before several times, actually. Even in European countries, it's happened. Like a major party has done it. So political and financial gain usually is the point. Or sometimes, as I say, with some more sophisticated and long-term operations, it's about shaping the opinions of the sort of users in a particular country, in a particular region, away from something and towards something else. So say, people in country A, used to have a sort of favorable opinion about topic J, and then the country C comes in and has a specific geopolitical interest in that country and tries to direct the attention and interest of users in that country towards themselves. But we can get more into those types of campaigns. Again, they're extremely sophisticated, and usually, as Nina and Carl said, usually done by those are the types that usually are done by states or done by people hired by states on their behalf in order to cover the tracks.
Just coming back to Nina here, and I think you all have interesting insights in this from different perspectives, but when I think the general public often consider what tactics people use, we're all sort of, I think, shaped a bit by the fake news conversations that happened around sort of 2016. You had teenagers in Eastern Europe basically just making up stuff about the Pope, for instance, in order to get clicks, and they were doing a particular style of disinformation campaign driven by a particular set of financial goals. But obviously there are a really broad range of tactics here, and it's not as simple as writing a fake article. They've really evolved quite a lot. I mean, Nina, what are some of the tactics maybe that you see, and what are the ones you're really concerned about? Because obviously some of them are more effective and some of them work in ways that we might not be able to spot.
Yeah, well, I think this is a really important question because they've really shifted a lot since 2016, and that's because of a couple of things. Obviously, like people's awareness of influence campaigns more broadly is much higher. That doesn't mean that they're great at spotting them all the time, but they know this stuff is out there. And so do the platforms, right? The platforms are doing a fairly decent job taking down at least foreign influence campaigns. They've dedicated more staff to it. They're not just ignoring it as the elephant in the room as they were before. That being said, the thing that has worried me for a long time is the way that foreign malign actors can use information laundering in order to access the information ecosystems of whatever adversarial state they're trying to influence in that point. And what I mean by this is they can either introduce hacked materials, leaked materials, or frankly, forged materials. We saw Russia attempt to do during the 2017 presidential election in France in order to influence the debate there. And they introduced those things through really trusted authentic local actors. It's not necessarily going to be a troll or a bot. It's not going to be, you know, a shit posting campaign, right? It's going to be somebody who can get on a local news or can get on, has a, you know, built-in audience already and can say, look at these documents. They show corruption of XYZ politician, right? And you can fill in the blank there. That resonates in many of our countries that are represented here today. Excuse me. And I think that that's one of the things that's most difficult to spot, and it's most difficult to combat as well, because then you have issues about freedom of expression that we run smack into. Like, what do we do if you have, and I'm just going to pick on him because he does spread a lot of disinformation, a Rudy Giuliani, somebody that is, you know, again, an authentic American voice in the political spectrum, who has been involved in the past with the security services of states like Russia. What do you do if that's the case? And you're not going to necessarily launch an investigation from the FBI or any other intelligence services. And that's the question that a lot of democracies are now asking themselves, particularly as this issue becomes politicized. So in terms of what to watch out for, I mean, the thing that I always tell people is if you feel like something's too good to be true, then it probably is. If you find yourself getting emotional about something that you're seeing online, there's a reason for that. Think about who's sharing it. Think about what the stakes are for that outlet, that reporter, that, you know, expert who's commenting on it. All of that is really important to take into account, and then take a couple steps back, take a beat, try to do some basic fact checking, which I think we're going to talk about later in the program today. And then only then, after you've, you know, given yourself some space from that material, should you think about sharing it.
And you know, I know from my own experience that I'm a journalist who's, you know, worked in this area for ages, and I've still looked at things. I've even retweeted things that I later find out are, you know, examples of misinformation that are false, that were to some extent intended to mislead me. And, you know, theoretically, I should be more immune to this stuff. Anyone can kind of fall for it. I mean, just come back to you, Cheyenne, for a second. You know, there's a lot of sophisticated stuff out there, but also a lot of the tactics are really simple, aren't they? You know, people are very worried about deep fakes, and potentially they're going to be a bigger issue, you know, when people can come up with a simulated version of someone saying words they never said that looks very believable. But also a lot of the tactics are really, really basic, aren't they, Cheyenne?
Yeah, they are. I mean, I'll obviously answer your question. It was just because Nina made a really good example about how sometimes states use like sort of indirectly influence politicians, or, you know, the general politics. I mean, I don't know if people remember or even know, but before the 2019 general election here in the UK, do you remember the US-UK leak operation when the Labour Party revealed the sort of a series of leaked documents of secret negotiations between the UK government and the US government about a potential trade deal at the time. And the Labour Party said, you know, in this area, we think, you know, there are issues for workers, or, you know, standards are going to come down on food safety and security, all that stuff, which is perfectly, you know, at the time, look, and still does, you know, for a political party in a general election, you've got something on the, you know, party in power, and you think it's perfectly legitimate for voters to know. The interesting story about it was those documents actually came from an unknown account on Reddit that have been posting those documents on several platforms for like a month, and no one had seen them. And then that same account on several platforms started just directly posting those documents to politicians, to journalists, and then finally one of those posts on Reddit took off, and the Labour Party saw it. And obviously the Labour Party used it in the campaign. It was only afterwards that we realized, through an investigation by Reddit, that account had actually originated from Russia. And they thought it could be linked to the Russian government, but they couldn't prove it. So, you know, on the face of it, that was perfectly legitimate for, you know, even the Labour Party at the time didn't know, you know, where it comes from. But it just turns out, you know, it could have been. We still don't know for sure. No one knows. It could have been that the Russian government hacked those leaked documents and put them online, and the Labour Party saw them. That's it. That could be the scenario. As for like the sophistication, yeah, I mean that's like one of my pet peeves. And, you know, when people not to undermine the importance of, you know, AI and sort of you know, deep for some time people were like so sort of obsessed with deep fakes. Now everyone is like on AI, but I mean, my point is always like, for heaven's sake, just go on Twitter or Instagram or on TikTok or on Reddit, and just look at the material that goes viral. I mean, you're talking about like some sophisticated deepfake that no one without spending tons of money and quite a lot of time can produce. Our problem at the moment is like somebody photoshopping an image of Joe Biden and Volodymyr Zelensky holding hands and sort of kissing, and then that getting 2,000 retweets and 54,000 likes and 10 million views on Twitter. Like, you have to like tell people, who are sharing that's, by the way, not, this is the original. Someone has actually doctored this. Like that's that. I'm not saying that AI or deepfakes or these sophisticated digital techniques are not a problem. They will be a problem. And I'm sure 5 years from now, 10 years from now, even if I'm not alive and somebody else is doing this job and people are having a discussion, it will be sort of the sort of one of the main topics that they will be discussing. But we as people who could do this work day to day and members of the public have to worry about those things when Joe or Ken or Sally from their like bedroom using their phone and a free app can produce an excellent deepfake of a politician or of a celebrity or an influencer or a sort of an excellent AI video or an AI image that could easily in like 2 minutes on their mobile phone or on their desktop can just do it without paying a penny, without spending too much time. That's the point where things get really, really difficult. At the moment, if you want to, I mean, obviously with AI, particularly in the last few months, things, particularly with Midjourney, things have got much, much better. Like you can produce really, really good fake AI images now, but still the technology is still not there. I mean, if you start seeing a few few sort of AI images that on the surface look good, but if you start paying a bit more attention, you will get the hang of it, how to tell what the sort of telltale signs are. The technology is still not there 100%. It's got immensely better, but it's still not there. With deepfakes, I'm not worried too much at this stage because, as I say, if you want to produce a really, really good deepfake of me saying something that is against BBC editorial policy and get me sacked, you have to pay quite a lot of money and spend quite a bit of time to produce it. Your average person, sat, in their bedroom on their mobile phone or on their PC cannot do it.
I think one of the things you mentioned there, the report about the NHS that the Labour Party in the UK took up, obviously is perhaps one of the examples of when Nina was saying, "Is this thing too good to be true?" Maybe think twice about where it came from. Carl, I want to pick on something Sian said there, and I know we could probably talk about this an entire hour-long session, but the systems that we're all doing this on, the fact that things go viral and people don't correct them, people don't say this is fake. And the reason they don't do that is because if they say it's fake, people are going to share it less. That's part of a sort of bigger problem with the ecosystem that all this is taking place in, isn't it?
Yes, and there lies my invitation to bash the platforms. And of course, there needs to be a bit of bashing there because they've built platforms that are designed to maximize attention. And we've just realized over the last 5 or 6 years what a horrible environment that creates for democracies and consensus-seeking discussions and pretty much anything that doesn't kind of end up in rancor and discord. But I do actually want to make a slightly different point as well, which to me I think kind of maybe sweeps together, or maybe the other panelists disagree with whether this sweeps together the examples. To me, the biggest misconception about the problem is the idea that what is happening here are these bad actors are going around and lying to people and getting them to change their minds, and that's the harm. You talk to any behavioral scientist in the world, and they'll tell you that the way that you influence people is by confirming their beliefs and harnessing it in certain directions. Because doing that allows you to activate all these different heuristics and biases and lazinesses that we all have as human beings. We tend to slot things into various kinds of worldview. So those 2,000 people sharing Cheyenne picture of Zelensky and Biden, I would be astonished if those 2,000 people aren't already enmeshed in a culture war and in a political contest where that picture doesn't delight them. I mean, those are partisans. That picture confirms a view, probably hilariously, that they already have about the world. And that's time and time again what we see. And for people, I can see some people are asking questions like, what do we do about this? You know, and I know we'll get onto that. Like, one of the first things that people could have to realize to begin to build defenses themselves is that they are most vulnerable when they are nodding their head and have something online which they're slotting into worldview and thinking, I always knew it was the case. I expected nothing less. You know, the most dangerous, to me, the most dangerous kind of model of change that you see is where you have campaigns which answer people's grievances, recontextualize those grievances, whatever they are. You know, it could be professional or political or social or usually financial. They recontextualize those as largely being a question of some kind of in-group, out-group kind of like dynamic where your identity is under threat. Your political point of view is being pursued. You can't say what you want anymore. Society's changing around you. They harden that dynamic. They convince you that you're under threat. Your identity is what's being targeted, and that's why your life isn't going the way that you want it to. They harden that in-group, out-group distinction, and ultimately activate your outrage to make you begin to do certain things. And you know, the way that people feel is a much stronger motivator than what they think. So we've got to get away from the idea that these influence campaigns, and the main threats we see online are primarily, exclusively, or even mainly to do with truth and lies. Like they're as much to do with making people feel certain ways as think certain ways. And you know, that to me has always been the vulnerability of kind of us understanding this as being a question of disinformation, or before that, fake news. Because what it does is it already leans us to a whole series of solutions, be that fact checking, or be that platform responses, or be that even law now, which have to do with truth and lies, and that doesn't fix the problem.
Can I just comment on that, because that's an excellent point. I mean, when people ask me why is it, you know, somebody asked me once, what's so different about America that it's so much more susceptible to conspiracy theories and misinformation than sort of other sort of major democracies on a scale that is obviously kind of incomparable. And I said, because America as a country is far more hyper-partisan and has a far more sort of intense culture war. And obviously people who are involved in it, you know, want to win that war at any cost. And particularly the people who I'm one of them, they we call permanently online people. You kind of get deeply steeped into it. And at some point, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter whether what you're sharing is true or false, or whether it's ridiculous, or whether, you know, people are going to believe it. To you, all that matters is that, you know, that content that you're sharing and is going viral is one step towards winning that culture war or political war, or, you know, get your side getting one over the other side. And from the viewpoint, because obviously misinformation is not just about politics, but from the viewpoints of political, social, cultural misinformation, hyper-partisanship and content that confirms your own personal bias is without a shadow of a doubt the sort of main driver of it.
It's quite a depressing picture in many ways. You know, taking advantage of the worst characteristics of human nature. I really want to move on to hopefully some of the more optimistic, potentially constructive stuff to challenge some of this and what we can do about it. We've had one really interesting question that harks back to what we've been talking, which I'd just like to put to, I think, Nina. Nina first. Are there any specific markers that you watch for to distinguish who is actually behind a particular influence campaign? You know, are there certain ways they do things? Are there certain techniques, for instance, between Iran or Russia?
Yeah, so I think in general, and I would be interested in everyone on the panel's assessments of this as well, but in general, I mark kind of Russia as the most sophisticated of the big three, if you will, of China, Iran, Russia. Just because they've been at this for the longest, they've been trying out these techniques for the longest, and they've progressed, as I said before, past kind of the bots and trolls to the more circuitous and obfuscated influence operations. And I think also they're not necessarily purely propaganda, right? Whereas when you see stuff coming from China, it is always putting forth the Chinese worldview, trying to kind of impress upon people the goodness of China, the benevolence of China, the kind of strength of China. That might have been how the Soviet Union did things, but that's certainly not how Russia does things today. And it's looking to divide people. So anything you see about divisiveness, I would say that tends to be Russia. But the best thing to do to identify where these things are coming from, particularly in the age of AI, which, I wrote something about this recently, trying to get ChatGPT to write social media copy coming from different partisans in the US election. You have to jump through some hoops to do it, but you can get it to do it if you know what you're trying to get at. And this means that, the things that were littered, posts that were littered with grammatical mistakes that would be endemic to a Russian speaker or a Chinese speaker or a Persian speaker before are not going to be littered with those grammatical mistakes that we might have looked for in the past. So what I would suggest is think about what is being expressed in the post. Again, that sort of divisiveness, furthering polarization is something that really benefits the Kremlin. As I said before, China tends to promote China or try to debunk what it sees as disinformation that is denigrating China. Iran has been an interesting actor, at least in the US elections. Recently, in the 2024 election, we saw Iranian actors impersonating the Proud Boys group, trying to get people to stay home from polls in swing states. So they're a little bit more of a wild card, but tend to be a little bit sloppy in the way that they conduct things. That's kind of how I see things. But again, just look at the content, see if that aligns with a particular country's goals. As my brilliant co-panelists have said, often even we, who are the experts in the field, can't attribute these operations because we don't have the back end data from the platforms, and we just have to kind of say something weird's going on here. Can you take a look at this? And then they'll either decide to take it down and talk about it in one of their transparency reports in the future, or sometimes we never hear back. That thing I sent them about Crimea that I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, never heard anything back from them. And I think some of those accounts are still up today, even though they were clearly engaging in spam behavior, which is a quick and dirty violation of the terms of service. I know there was another question in the chat about what we think of the usefulness and limitations of the transparency reports that the platforms put out. In particular, Meta, I find really frustrating in this regard, because we just have to trust everything that they say. They're like, there were this many accounts, it comes from here. We're not going to show you, our kind of forensics about how we figured that out. But this is the story. And we don't ever see any of the corroborating data there. Whereas Twitter of the past, pre-Musk Twitter, used to put out all of the accounts that they took down for researchers like us to play around with. And that was really, I think, a useful exercise. And I'd love to see more of that coming from the platforms. But given the direction they're all heading in terms of transparency around influence operations, I am very pessimistic about that occurring in the future.
Carl, I'd be really interested in your take on that second question, particularly in terms of what the platforms do in terms of the information they provide, to people who bother to read them. I should stress the question on that came from the Bureau's own Neve McIntyre, as someone who does read these on a regular basis. I'm really interested in your take on that, and also sort of moving into more generally, what should those companies be doing more of? What can be done to tackle these issues beyond what's currently happening? And also, if the companies can't do it, what are the institutional responses? What are the government responses? Because I think you kind of hope someone has some kind of idea about what might work to some extent.
Well, I'll ask some easy ones. These are much more straightforward than asking me to define influence operations. Genuine accountability and transparency has to be independent. There's simply no way. I mean, then I'd rather they do it than they don't, but it's certainly insufficient, right? Like we just simply don't create transparency mechanisms where you ask the very organization that needs to be transparent and accountable to produce that accountability. It doesn't work. Like, that's why we have independent research communities. That's why we have journalists and everyone else working on these things. So the simple answer is that the platforms have to produce the data to allow independent research to occur on their platforms. Mm-hmm. They have to. Like, we cannot sail into a world where researchers cannot see what's going on these platforms, and that's the way it's going. There's a big countervailing force, though. So both EU regulation, maybe even UK regulation, coming into force is going to, in one way or another, have to mandate that kind of access. So we will see what we get to in the years ahead. It's not a council of despair for sure. I would love one person watching this to maybe ask their MP about this sort of thing, because like ultimately it's not going to be us researchers that will make that change happen. It will be a political intervention. It will be big institutions like NATO and others, and the Commission, European Commission, stepping in, forcing that to happen. And the more actually that just normal people can talk about this, that we badly need help to make this point. Lastly, I just actually want to talk about the project, Jasper, just briefly, because I think that comes in nicely here too. And so the way this has happened maybe for the last 10 years, all the way going back to the very roots of this, where it was a bunch of geeky think tankers and academics that began to notice weird things happening on these platforms, is it's largely been us looking at online data sets in one way or another. Now that some of that's been OSINT, brilliant work that's done, like really kind of, understanding individual accounts and how they're behaving. My neck of the woods has always been around data science, though, and trying to understand big patterns and signals and suspicious behavior at kind of grander scales, and using that as the way of kind of zeroing in. But whether one way or another, it's largely been to do with online data. And as everyone, I think, has said, like, we're seeing the limits of that when it comes to attribution. And largely, if we're going to talk about responses, making the lives of the people doing this costlier, riskier, more prone to discovery, and ultimately actually, beginning to look at legal mechanisms, whether that's kind of consumer rights legislation or criminal law, to begin to respond to it, we have to attribute. Now, partly that's a question of platforms handing over more data, but partly, and this is what I think the project is about, or at least one of the big aims I have, hopes for it, is actually weaving together the kind of arcane, strange world of data science with like shoe leather investigative journalism. Because like I often feel like those two worlds haven't really spoken much. And it is journalism, it is sting operations, it's people doing forensic accounting, it's people revealing hidden organizational realities. That's the toolkit to move from weird stuff we see online to possibly, attributions we can print and people that might be behind it and like why they're doing it, and and investigations that states and others can do. Like so it's a first step, but I hope the field moves towards kind of wrapping those two proud kind of investigatory kind of traditions together, because that's really what we need to go from a weird thing happening online all the way through to some product which allows us to actually hold real people, not accounts, but real people, real liabilities, accountable for what they're doing.
And that is exactly the hope we have for the Influence Ops project, which we are building up as we speak. And you can read more about that on the TBIJ website, as well as the many other areas that the TBIJ works in, investigating various different aspects of wrongdoing, and hopefully to trying to spark the kind of change here that Carl's saying, that actually things that actually happen as a result of the journalism and the work we do. We talked a bit about what we can do. We've talked a little bit about what the platforms aren't really doing, a little bit about what the governments are sort of doing. We're also here to try and give you maybe a little bit of a tip or two on what you can do. And so I'm going to come here to Cheyenne, because as I said, he's one of the people who does this day in, day out incredibly effectively. And Cheyenne, you've got just a pretty simple example of a way people can check stuff out themselves, which I thought we might just run through quickly.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be nice. I mean, I try to, via my Twitter account, try to usually sort of try to help people sort of do sort of simple stuff, because the sort of field of disinformation research and reporting is very, very small, and that's not a good thing. Like the people who do this as a professional job on a day-to-day basis, there's really, like, you'd be surprised how tiny that field is, and it shouldn't be. And some of it is really not that complicated. And nowadays with word technologies, there's quite a lot. I think people ask me, like, when I sort of point out some easy sort of video manipulation or some doctored image on Twitter that had gone like mega viral, people go, how did you do that? And it's like, okay, this is how I did it. You could do it at home. It takes 5 minutes. So a few months ago, I did like a lengthy thread about how to verify images online, for the sort of simple regular person. Forget about all the sort of sophisticated things that people who are 10 million times better than me and could get me out of my job within a second. Some of the stuff I see that people do in the community is just insane. But really, really simple stuff that you don't have to pay any money. All the tools are freely available. So I wrote a thread about that. So this is an example from that. So you can see, by the way, if you don't know Stu Peters, he's one of the worst conspiracy theories online. He is the man. He's the man behind a movement known as Died Suddenly. If you haven't heard about it, I envy you. He's a major conspiracy theorist and anti-vaxxer. He was suspended by Twitter a few years ago. Obviously allowed back under Elon Musk. He's been bestowed a blue tick now, and his tweets are pushed to sort of as many users as possible on the platform. And yeah, if you go read his timeline, you will see what I'm talking about. So if you remember, earlier this year there was a very deadly earthquake in Turkey, and unfortunately plenty of people died. And then, as is usually the case with these types of natural disasters or major events, there's immediately a campaign of misinformation online, and people try to sort of make up stories about what happened, or sort of point people's anger in the wrong direction. That's the thing. When something goes wrong and politicians need to be held accountable for it, you need to ask them the right question, not nonsensical stuff like this. So he was trying to say that this cloud that was in the image of which you can see there, he was trying to say that was evidence of some wrongdoing. In this case he points out HARP, which is some long-standing conspiracy theory about the US government, the US military, doing sophisticated stuff in different parts of the world to cause natural disasters. Whatever. Okay, so he's posted this image, and as you can see, it's got 170,000 views. So you want to check this. You want to see, okay, where this image is coming from. And he's saying this image was taken immediately before the earthquake that hit Turkey, right? So all you have to do, if you're using Google Chrome, and in this case, even if you're using another browser, it's not that sophisticated. You can just go to Google Lens, or you could go to images.google.com and do it yourself. But in this case, if you're using Google Chrome, it's even easier. Just right click on the image, as you see I've done there, and then you go to search image with Google. That's all you have to do. And once you've done that, if you go to the next slide, you can see Google starts bringing up the same image, because this process is called reverse image search. So what it does is, what Google is doing here via its new tool called Google Lens. Previously it was just Google reverse image search. Now there's a bit more sophisticated tool called Google Lens. What it's doing is trying to find examples of that image on the internet, and it's sort of trying to bring up as many of other users of that image on the internet that it can. Now, your job basically as a journalist or as somebody who's just checking this for yourself is try and find the first time this image was used on the internet, right? So you want to see where this image came from initially. In this case, it's actually really simple, because as soon as you do the search, Google brings up a video from The Guardian, as you can see there, and that video was posted by The Guardian 3 weeks before the earthquake. And The Guardian explains this was a natural phenomenon that's called a lenticular cloud. That's something that happened, had nothing to do with the earthquake in Turkey, had nothing to do with the US government or the US military doing some sort of nefarious activity in there and causing the earthquake. And then they're already within sort of several minutes, you've got your answer without spending any money, without doing anything exceptionally difficult. If you specifically, like me, want to find specific, have you got the next slide? Yeah, if like me, you specifically want to find out where that image actually came from, source it exactly, you can just sift through the results. And if you do, in this case, I came across this post on Instagram, and you can see that particular person who if you look at their account, says they live in Turkey, and in this case, they specifically took that image at 8 o'clock in a city in Turkey. And I actually contacted them and I asked, did you take that image? Do you live there? And they said yes. So there you go. You've already sort of easily debunked a sort of viral claim made by conspiracy theorists, and it took several minutes, and you didn't spend any money to do it.
Thanks, Shan. I mean, it is sort of ludicrous how simple some of the stuff that you can use to do this is for anyone to use, and there are loads of resources out there that can enable you to do it in often a short period of time. Although when they get really sophisticated and complex, and as we said, finding out who's behind stuff is a real challenge. And one of the questions we've got in, which I think is an episode one, is obviously we do have a UK election coming up in the not too distant future. Carl, I mean, we're thinking about this as part of our project, but also, we're thinking about this all the time. What kind of stuff do you think people should be looking out for when it comes to the UK?
Well, I mean, there's things that we, of course, all of us as consumers of news can do. And I think everyone kind of going into general elections like the UK, which will be targeted, take my word for it, by a myriad of overlapping and competing influence operations on probably every single side of the political debate that you can think of. You have to know that you're stepping into a contested space. You have to know that your attention is a form of territory, and you have to know that behavioural and attitudinal outcomes are exactly the ones that are being sought after. I would do a couple of things actually. I would try and guard against outrage. I really wouldn't go onto online spaces really to try and either debate with people that I disagree with, or certainly not to think I might ever resolve those debates over the coming election. I would be very aware of fictitious identity. I really wouldn't believe who people say they are online. Identity is a really unsolved problem for us at the moment. I would slow down, just slow everything down. I mean, one of the things that I think people kind of trying to work on this weird tradecraft have worked out is that you can really exploit speed. Like, you really try and get people to share stuff and do stuff before they think about it, before kind of Daniel Kahneman's kind of type 1 brain kicks in. Viral advertisers, by the way, mimetic engineers, as they might call themselves, this is one of the things that they know very well, is like to clean away all the ballast to get you to feel something immediately. And probably I mean, if you take away nothing else from what I said this evening, maybe this, treat your information diet a bit like a diet. It has health consequences for you and for the people around you. I mean, I can't tell you how sad the pandemic was for me when every week there were people contacting me talking about people getting sucked into conspiracy theories and other form of kind of radical and extremist mobilizations and mobilizations that hated and distrusted journalists and writers and the mainstream and politicians and everyone. As that happened, I kind of really realized that process is quite similar to a process of radicalization or actually being indoctrinated to a cult, and trashes like all of their conventional normal relationships, familial and friendships that they have in their lives. And it was very, very hard for family members to see that happen and to know what to do about it. So that has, all of that has consequences, and it's going to have consequences here. So for normal people, that's how I would go into the election. And lastly, for really, really important decisions, like whether your polling booth is open or not, whether there's been a bomb gone off in central London, other stuff, like actually de-digitize, get off social media platforms, find that out another way. Certainly don't find that out from peers, and don't find that out from user-generated content. I think on really important decisions, actually row back from the digital world for a bit. I hope I don't have to give this advice forever, because I hope that the kind of safeguards ultimately that we build and all the work that's being done will systemically change these online spaces to make them less exploitable and exploited. But right now, I don't think I can say that. And of course, elections are kind of, we know how targeted they are. So anyway, sorry, I really don't mean to be a counsel of despair. This is probably my last comment, so I'll end on a final thought. We will get on top of this. Like, we will solve this. Well, not really solve, but we will manage this as a risk, like we have with lots of other big kind of macro threats in the past. This is not unsurmountable. I don't think democracies are about to dissolve. I don't think our institutions are about to keel over. And I don't think most people actually are going to become conspiracy theorists and pull down the walls of the Houses of Parliament. This is just a new threat. It's sprung up remarkably quickly. But what has also happened is a tremendous upwelling of people and institutions and great minds that are working on the problem. So we will get on top of it.
Thanks, Carl. And we're running out of time, but I just feel I'm honor bound to point out that when Stu Peters has previously been contacted by the BBC over his activity, he's described their efforts as an attempt to try to discredit him or his film, rather than talking about millions of people dying from the COVID vaccines. Give everyone a chance to reply. Really running out of time, but I'm going to have one last question just for Nina. We are getting much better at sort of dealing with finding, sorry, this comes from the audience. We're getting a lot better at finding and highlighting misinformation, but we still actually don't know a hell of a lot about how it impacts people and whether it impacts people in significant ways. What can we do to actually change that? What can we do to actually find more out about what the impact is on real people?
I mean, that is one of the key challenges of studying disinformation and influence operations more broadly. It's a bit like, and forgive me, this comes from my recent the fact that I had a kid recently, and there's so much that's infuriating when you're pregnant. They're like, we don't know how this drug affects pregnant people because we can't study it, right? It's kind of similar morally and scientifically about how we study the effects of disinformation. What we'd have to do is essentially track people's browser activity and then do polling about who they voted for or their behavior in real life. Have you attended protests like this, et cetera, to really understand the effect on elections and social movements. However, I would point to a couple of key events that have happened over the last couple of years. Obviously, we have the real life protests that happened as late as 2017 related to Russian influence operations around the US election. We have the insurrection at the US Capitol. We have the various protests around the world claiming that COVID wasn't real or that masks and vaccines were killing people, right? We know that this has real world effects. What we don't know is exactly what the turning point is. And I'm not sure we ever will know that because of the reasons I just described, because it's just, we can't study people in the wild without their consent. And I don't think we're going to get these folks to consent to that. And I'm not sure we should. So it's difficult, but I think all we can keep doing is inquiring the way that we're doing. I think platforms would help if they opened up their data and were a little bit more transparent about the work that they're doing. And journalists like you can keep pounding the pavement. I'm really excited to see what comes from this project.
Thanks very much. And I mean, we would all love the platforms to share a lot more information because they are really the people who actually have, to be honest, the best visibility on what's happening in their world. Guys, thank you very much. That's all we've got time for. Thanks to Nina, Cheyenne, and Carl. Thanks very much for the audience questions as well. That's us. Thanks very much.